Hello everyone, welcome to another Daily Muppet. Just wanted to get on this one quickly as there's a lot of news going out there regarding the new manager position and what that means for transfers and the summer activity. You're going to see a lot of news going around, some of it true, some of it not true, a lot of journalists looking to get a jump on things and outlets looking for a lot of stories in all of the hype. So I figured it was important to get right into this and cover what the actual plans were. Back in February, we released the transfer chart, which indicated that United were looking at 2 midfielders and a striker this summer, which has been confirmed by Ducker and others since then. You have reports today about Calvin Phillips from Luckhurst, which are being somewhat denied by Jonathan Schrager on Twitter. You have reports of quite a few different players coming through here at the moment. One of the other names there's listed is Danjuma. Obviously, you're going to see a lot of links to Ten Hag players such as Anthony, Timber, all of that. I think that there's some truth to that, but I think it's a little bit just being overstated. It's easy links. If you look at the articles, what they said, the breaking ones, the one from ESPN and some of the others, basically Ten Hag will be presented with the shortlist from the club. And then obviously he has some say and he can have some input and make some suggestions. From what I understand, there are 4 players he would suggest the club look at. That doesn't mean 4 players to buy. So let's talk about those real quickly, and then we will dive into the transfer chart and go through the club's targets. Number 1 is Anthony is a real link. He would want to bring him from Ajax. I reported that ages ago. It's been confirmed by multiple people. The cost may be prohibitive, but let's discuss it when we get into the chart so we can see if it's really reasonable. Timber is one, but I think it makes more sense for him to potentially be a right back. So this could be something for next year. One thing I want to mention on that again is that I think a whole change in the backline structure is likely to be a 2023 project when we try to finish the team rather than a this summer project. This is not a 1-year restructure. This is not a 1-year project. This is a long-term thing, and it's going to take some time. Let me just move this closer here. I think that the other two, there's 2 other players that I've heard. One is Devin Wrench, who's an excellent, fantastic right back. Young, basically seen as a prodigy from Ten Hag. Could be one for the future if we move a right back on to bring him in as the long-term one. But he could, I don't know much about that. And then the other one is Lisandro Martinez, the DM for Ajax. But these are ones, again, I'm not sure that any of these are going to be realistic this summer. I think the club really have their targets. So you're going to see a lot of stories out there, a lot of names, a lot of links, a lot of things going on. It doesn't necessarily mean that it is all true. There are complications, there are names, there are scouts, there are people trying to get their name in front of everything. One of the things that was also mentioned, again, is that Ten Hag was selected for fitting within the structure of the club, which is a bit less on right now the coach making transfer choices, decisions, and driving the transfer strategy, but a top-down view where Murtaugh, Fletcher, and the recruitment team put things together, and then Ten Hag is making, obviously, calls and has input and wants to kind of have some part of this, but they'll be making transfers that fit his style. And his style certainly has to do with 2 hard-working midfielders behind a creator, Bruno, and who can maybe be similar to a Tadic for him, and then a striker ahead. And I think we'll see something similar to that. So given that we have a few players like that, let's go through the chart and look at how this works. A while back, we mentioned that 80 million budget is likely to be nonsense. James Ducker today says the war chest terminology, saying that 150. I think that's realistic. I think 125 to 150 net is realistic. One of the things I will say is I think they would rather spend around 150 and then Sales would not necessarily be added to the budget, but we'll talk about that in a moment, how that might work, and run through all the different scenarios and see how this works. So I'm going to put the transfer chart up on screen and make my face smaller so you can see what I'm going through here. Starting at the left side, let's just run through the targets. My understanding is the short list for list A of defensive midfielders is now basically Declan Rice. Tchouaméni could be on there, but based on the inquiries that have been made, he is likely to go somewhere else. So I have kind of scratched him off. I'll leave him on the flow chart, but I've scratched him off the list on the left. List B, and this is again for the defensive midfield position. It's important to pay attention to the different aspects here, is Calvin Phillips, João Palhinha, and Tyler Adams from Leipzig. Central midfielder, Haidara Lamer, I've heard is back on the list legitimately. He was of interest a few years ago before his major injury. Went off the list, but now he seems to have recovered and is performing excellently out of contract in a year from summer. May be available for a very, very good price and is a fantastic player, very much in a Fred mold, but a bit more physical. A workhorse, a ball winner, something we definitely need in the club. And then there's Jimmy Garner, and we'll have to talk about him a bit more in a moment. As far as the striker list goes, I think it's going to take a little bit of time to kind of build that out fully, but as you can still see, as is being reported, the list A is Kane. Nunez is on there. Jonathan David I've put on there, but I don't think it's likely. Nkunku I also don't think is likely, but for the price he would be list A. On list B, you would then have Dominic Calvert-Lewin and Nesri, Tammy Abraham, Watkins, and Adeyemi. Most of those are unlikely. I think a list B striker is not what they want. You could even see a situation where they might rather, if they cannot get a list A striker, go for a winger instead. But we'll get back to that again. For wide forwards, you have Dembele, Rafinha, Antony, and Danjuma, who's been linked today. I just threw him on there for that reason. Center back replacements, and we'll talk about the specific scenarios there. You have Akanji, Ginter, Tapsoba, Botman, Guardiol, and then you could say Timber, but I'm not sure he would be. For right back, Aarons, Livramento, and Devin Wrench, and maybe Timber would be in that position. For goalkeeper, you have links to Bonos, Diogo Costa. Sam Johnstone looks like he has now an agreement with Tottenham. But again, we'll talk about that whole thing in a moment. So let's look at the left. We expect free agents Pogba, Mata, Lingard, and Cavani to all go. We expect sales without replacement to be Pereira, Axel, Jones to go. And they might add to the budget, maybe not, but they won't be replaced one for one. One major note here is if James Garner can come through and get a chance, then likely you're not going to get a second mid in any scenarios. And depending on the situation, a budget might move over to a winger instead. Let's first talk about the whole flow. We'll start on the left. The plan number one is to purchase a list A central midfielder, defensive midfielder, likely more focused on the DM side of things. If we start on the left, if they can get Rice or Tchouaméni, they're going to get Rice or Tchouaméni. And I think there's still a potential that Rice could be under 100 million. We'll keep an eye on that. There's just some things out there that are hard to confirm or nail down, but depending on United's where they end up, depending on where West Ham end up, it really may not be the price that's going out there. If they can get him and a list A striker, Kane or Nunez, maybe with some player swaps in terms of Kane, that would probably finish the summer from a major position. You might think of it as they have 80 to 100 million budgeted for the midfield, 60 to 80 million for the forward, and then some sales would bring it down to around that 150, 125 range. What you have going below that, however, is if Van de Beek is sold, then you would sign a list at B mid. That's probably not likely. It could happen that you could get Rice and a midfielder and a striker, but it would be more likely that if he is sold and Tony Martial is sold, that you would get something like a winger that the budget would go to there. And again, this could depend on James Garner. If Garner comes through, Rice comes in, and a striker comes in, that would probably be it. So in this left side, if you get Declan Rice, I think the most likely scenario is Declan Rice, list a striker, and that's probably, and James Garner sticks around, and that's probably it. But you might see some budget move towards a second midfielder or a winger, depending on if Van de Beek can be sold, if Martial is sold, and if those other sales go through of Pereira, Axel, and Jones. On the right side, if they fail to get Declan Rice, let's say Rice is out, and this may be a scenario we're looking at, they would look to sign a list B defensive midfielder, Calvin Phillips, Palhinha, or Tyler Adams. Then they would still look to get that list A striker. If they couldn't get a list A striker, maybe it would be a list B striker, maybe it would be a winger instead. If Van de Beek is sold, then they would also look at a second midfielder. Even if Donny is not sold, they would probably look at a second midfielder, but that would again be pending on Jimmy Garner. If he makes it through and looks to have a role in the team next year, you'd likely not get a second midfielder as well. And then, of course, Tony Martial being sold would likely add to a winger. So there's a few scenarios here. If Declan Rice is brought in, the way I look at it is you bring him in, bring in a striker. That's probably this summer unless you get a ton of sales, in which case maybe you could find the budget for a midfielder or a winger depending on James Garner. If Declan Rice is not brought in, then you'd look to get someone like Calvin Phillips, Palhinha, or Adams, and then you'd look to get a top striker, and then you would say, depending again on James Garner, a second midfielder, if like a Haidara, or a Conrad Lamer. If not, then you could probably move that budget to a forward and expect to get a winger. So what I think is happening here is the two most likely scenarios are Declan Rice and a striker, or two midfielders and a striker, or a midfielder, a striker, and a right winger. I think that it's sort of, there's a lot of flux there. That's going to be much more clear based on Declan Rice as we get closer to summer, and much more clear as well based on if James Garner can get a role. But considering that, I think you're unlikely to see two midfielders until James Garner has gotten a chance. I think the second midfielder is the last thing that'll happen. If it does, you'll see Declan Rice or Calvin Phillips or Palhinha or Adams. You'll see the striker come in, and then you'll see, based on James Garner, based on sales, either another midfielder or a winger in that scenario. There's a couple other things worth mentioning that are sort of disconnected. If Bahia sold in addition to Jones, you might look for a center back to come in this summer, separate to everything else. That's just positional. If Dallo or Wan-Bissaka is sold, you would probably like to see a right back come in, or Ethan Laird return, or Brandon Williams return. But the other names mentioned, Aarons, Livramento, and Wrench. If Dean is not chosen as the number one, or is leaving the club, sold or loaned, there will be a backup keeper. So those are all separate scenarios that can occur. So this is kind of the early run through of summer. These are all the names that we could be looking at and to keep an eye on for now. And we'll obviously update as we continue moving forward. Obviously, there's a lot of questions to be answered for a lot of these scenarios, and it might get a lot simpler as we move ahead. So I hope that answers a lot of the questions for now. Thanks for watching. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, turn notifications on, and I'll see you in the next video.